Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. And welcome. So today's a little bit of an unusual Lightroom presentation for me, partly because it's not really about Lightroom, but that's okay. It's a good thing, actually, in this case, I think. I hope you think. But what I mean by that is that partially we're talking about photography more so. And essentially, what was the title? Something about all I learned about my photos that I learned from Lightroom or something like that. I learned from Tim Gray, thank you. So talking about learning from our images, and essentially really what this boils down to is trying to become a better photographer. Anybody interested in trying to become a better photographer? Oh, that's good, you came to the right place, at least to talk about some of the concepts involved. And not so much necessarily about specific photographic techniques per se, although there'll be some of that, but more, how can we use our existing images and kind of use our review process in Lightroom or whatever software you happen to be using in order to become a better photographer. And I mean a variety of different things by that, but all of it boils down to having more images that you really like. So let's start with an image that I know that you are really going to like. Don't be shy. Round of applause, standing ovation, it's all okay. You throw roses, like they do at the... Nobody? Anybody? Not a little ooh, at least. My tough crowd. I'll bet the YouTube audience is just going nuts over this. So you probably can't appreciate why this is such an amazing photo. So let me try and think of a reason. So you're all going to feel bad in a second. This is the very first photo that I was proud of. Now you wish you had applauded, don't you? There's self-esteem at play here. So nobody's still impressed by the photo. All right. Fortunately, this was taken back in high school. It was like 5 or 6 years ago, I think. Give or take a decade or two. So I learned some things from this photo. Let's go take a look. I'm going to go over in the library module in Lightroom, because we are talking about Lightroom today. I'm going to scroll down into the metadata section, and we'll take a look at the EXIF and IPTC metadata. So wait, where's the lens? Hold on, bear with me here. EXIF met. We'll just look at only EXIF. I wanted to see what aperture. I knew it was in here somewhere. Except it's not, because this isn't a digital photo. Because it wasn't really 5 or 6 years ago that I was in high school. It was 1 or 2 years longer than that. And so it was film, black and white. Do you guys remember when there was no color in film? Actually, there was color, but as a high school student, I couldn't afford the upgrade. But first picture I was really proud of, and first picture I was really embarrassed by. Because you guys, how many of you worked in the wet darkroom before? Not color, black and white. That's the only one that counts. Is that amazing or what? Do you sort of miss that? Yeah. Except for the smells and the extra time and the risk of having the temperature wrong in the developer and, yeah. But, emotionally we miss it. So I had this image, and you remember how we used to actually work with our images. Let me give you a little sense of what that might be like. It'd be something like that, right? I guess I could simulate that a little bit better. It'd be, something like that. Except there'd be a bunch of images, because, there are 36 frames to a roll. Man, what am I going to do with all these pictures? Unless you only got the 24 roll. And what was the older cameras with the roll? 12. And then have a medium format. What were you getting off your 110 rolls? 12? 120? What did I say? Did I say 110? I was thinking of the Kodak, the little cassette things. Isn't it fun to reminisce? Oh yeah. So you'd review. Maybe you'd make a contact sheet, or you just hold your negative up to the light and try and see which one was sharp. Because back then, boy, it was a mystery. Every now and then I might have a sharp photo. And so I'm looking at the contact sheet in this case, which basically, it's like a contact sheet, that you print from Lightroom, except you actually did it in the wet darkroom. You lay your strips and negatives down on the paper, you expose it, and you put it in the developer, and the image magically appears, complete with the frame, from it says Kodak or Fuji or whatever on the edge, what frame number, so you could easily find your photos later. And so I was referencing this, and wow, this picture, it was really, really cool. And part of it is that part of what made it special for me is that I had actually bothered to turn around. So this is in California. I grew up in California, Malibu Creek State Park, out where they filmed MASH, and walking, and the sun's behind me, and I turn around and see this big oak tree, and the sun's glinting through the branches. I'm like, well, this is really cool. I'm gonna take a picture of this. Being in high school and still listening to my high school photography teacher, thank you, Mrs. Bauer, I actually set up a tripod, a rare experience these days. But back then, I would actually set up a tripod for everything. And then up on, you mount your camera on it. Remember you had like 3 or 4 knobs and handles and bars and stuff? Maybe some of you still have those kind of old-fashioned tripods. Now I like the ball head, much more convenient. So it takes a little while to get things set up and get it perfect. Now you can appreciate that for a photo like this, let's switch back to our zoom option here. For a photo like this, it was worth all the effort, obviously. That's probably what you guys were thinking right now. Set up the shot, take the shot. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm still in high school, for crying out loud. And probably, actually I was driving then, but barely, not very well. And take the picture, get back, make my contact sheet. Oh, that looks interesting. I kind of knew at the time it might be kind of a fun photo because the sun was glinting through the trees. And so I went and made a print. Now, Mrs. Bauer wouldn't let me make a big print. I had to make a small print first, and then I could make a big print once I'd made a good print. The problem is then I didn't know how to dodge and burn for the bigger print, and it was frustrating, but it was probably a good lesson. I just haven't figured it out yet. But anyhow, I make a print, and I expose a piece of paper. It's still a blank sheet of paper at the moment. Slip it into the developer. It magically appears, and my reaction was, whoa, clouds! I didn't even know there were clouds when I took the picture, and I certainly didn't know there were clouds when I looked at the contact sheet, but I was really delighted that there were clouds when I made an actual print. So that was kind of a not so subtle lesson in pay attention, you fool. And I've tried to pay attention to my subjects ever since. And then I noticed the sun up there, which was part of the reason I took the photo in the first place. And so I went to my teacher and said, Mrs. Bauer, look what the sun did. How did that happen? Now, I'll admit, when I teach workshops, and I'm out with photographers, and I tell them that I'm a dork, and I'm cool with cliche, and I actually like starbursts in my photos at night. Some people, not so fond of them. I'm sorry, I apologize, it's a thing. It goes way back, clearly. Except now I know how to do it. Back then I had no clue. I'm actually a little bit surprised at how many photographers today don't know how to create a starburst effect, or how to make sure to avoid it if they're the kind that don't like the whole cliche thing. I had no clue whatsoever. And she explained to me, all you've got to do is stop down the lens. Well, of course I had stopped down the lens, not because I was thinking of stopping down the lens, but because the sun was in the frame, and so the meter was telling me, are you crazy? This thing's too bright, you got to darken it up. And I just happened to go to the aperture for that purpose. I'm sure that the shutter speed was probably pretty fast, a pretty short exposure duration. I don't know, let's go check the metadata. All right. So no clue whatsoever, which is part of the lesson of today and part of the benefit of digital, of course. But I had no clue. So a very early lesson, thank goodness, in know your equipment. We all know thy subject. Maybe pay attention to your subject enough to know that there's clouds in the background, and know your equipment so that you know how to accomplish certain effects. Not only how to accomplish them, but that they're even possible in the first place. I didn't know anything about this. I didn't know that a starburst was even a thing, that it was even possible, that in the future people were going to hate my photos because they have starbursts all over them. I did know they had this, the funny effect filters that'll turn every bright light into a starburst, but that's not the real kind of starburst. We need the genuine article. But I learned a lot from this photo. Eventually I learned that it's not a very good photo. That took a lot longer to learn. When I would present early on, way back, and I was presenting about photography, and I would share this as a good photo, and people would sort of say, what? It stung a little at first, but I got over it. So that's one of the huge disadvantages. Now, this is such an amazing photo, you would probably like to figure out how to create such a photo for yourself, I wish I could tell you, but I can't, because I don't know what aperture was used, and I don't know what shutter speed was used, and I don't have the GPS coordinates of that location, and I couldn't tell you what lens was used, whether or not the flash fired, and all this other information, all of which we can get from our photos because the camera records all this information for us automatically. Now, we all know this. None of us are surprised by this, but how many of you actually make an effort to learn about your photos based on the metadata and then go out and apply what you've learned in future photos? So I'm going to show you some examples of situations essentially where knowing about the settings, reviewing the settings in Lightroom, reviewing adjustments in Lightroom, figuring things out, looking at what went wrong in a picture, evaluating the photo, in my case using Lightroom, and then applying that either to make the picture right the next time or to take that concept and apply it somewhere else. But first, I want to start off with some examples of situations where the photo didn't work. And this is something I talk about a lot in the context of organizing your photos and more specifically reviewing your photos. And that is to separate out the emotion when you're reviewing your photos. And it is critically important. So we're going to play a little game here. We're going to do star ratings, except you guys are going to rate my images for me. Now, be gentle, please. I'm delicate. But 1 star means it's a really bad image and you'd probably delete it. 5 star means it's amazing and you're willing to write a check to me right now for that picture. And then you got the various values in between. So let's start with this. Go ahead and shout it out. 2 star. Like opening image, at least thank you 3-star people. This is like we're just getting started with this game. Oh, good point. You were probably looking at the projected image. The display, doesn't that look much better over on the display?
Actually, it's true because that's more saturated.
It's a little nicer over on that display versus this display. So okay. I appreciate that. Gentle at first, like let's ease him into it. We don't want to make him cry. So what do you think it was like to take this picture? Pretty cool, I gotta say. Anybody know where this is? Nobody? No. Does it look like Australia? Because I really want to go and I haven't been to Australia. That's good to know. No, actually, this is the Palouse Falls in eastern Washington state. And it's about 2.5 hours away from the town of Palouse, but it's in the region of Palouse. And this waterfall is really, really cool. You can see it falls into this like bowl of a gorge, and then it goes down this canyon. Really, really steep, these basalt cliffs. You're looking right down. That waterfall is 198 feet from top to bottom. Amazing. Can you imagine the deafening roar when you're standing there on the cliff, afraid that the vibrations of that roar are going to knock you right off the cliff, and you take the picture anyway? You know, a kayaker actually once rode, what would you call that? Paddled right off. Literally paddled off of it. And lived to have the video posted on YouTube. Go check it out. Amazing. Now, what did we think of the picture? It shows, look, there's a waterfall. And it's in an interesting geographical setup. Geological setup, I should say. Maybe, Tim, you should go back around sunset on a not so overcast day and you might get a better picture. Not so much. So when I first reviewed this, wow, such an impressive subject. 4 stars. Later, 3, 2, none. I'm never going to use this picture, except I have the luxury of being able to use bad pictures. So, I got to keep, that's why I don't delete anything.
You could make it into something. You could crop it and take the sky out.
I could crop it. I could apply some really strong adjustments. It's possible. Maybe I'll just go back, though. Another one. It's down in San Diego. You guys know Arthur Morris, great bird photographer. I was hanging out with him. photographing brown pelicans, one of my favorite birds, and cormorants and all sorts of other cool stuff, and was playing around long exposure. Just because it's a long exposure doesn't make it a good picture. It's, it's fine. The rock could use a little less whitewash effects on it from the pelicans. The rock sort of, there's not enough going on. I've got big old open space of water. Cool that it's been smoothed out by the long exposure, but at first like, whoa, yeah, long exposure, it's so cool. The more I look at the image, the less I like it. Now this was amazing. This is on the island of Hvar in Croatia. Highly recommend it. Come around this corner on this little walkway. Oh, this guy fishing on this little boat in the late afternoon light striking the town. There's so great contrast and blah, blah, blah. Except, no, it's just a boat in the dark shadows, and there's just not that much going on. It was a really cool visual experience for me. It wasn't necessarily worthy of taking the camera out of the bag. I mean, I'm glad I have this photo because it's a cool memory. I'm not hanging it on the wall anytime soon. Ooh, water droplets. Now, if we crop pretty heavily, and if we use the spot healing brush, the spot healing tool to clean up the area that I'm guessing like a cute little caterpillar who's going to be a butterfly someday ate part of the leaf, mildly interesting. This is natural rainwater, I will add. I was actually there to photograph spider webs, which turned out pretty cool, actually. Even made a video about it. But this one, it's okay. Again, cropping, there's some things that could be done to make it better, but I'm not going to win any prizes with this one. Can you imagine what it was like to be there? Yeah, that was cool. The photo, it's okay. It conveys a sense of colors and reflections, etc. It'd be better if the shoreline were not kind of going away from me at an angle, if I was like looking dead on across to the opposite shore. It'd be nicer if we had a little more red going on in there. It'd be nice if I didn't have power lines up at the top left corner of the frame. The water leaves a little to be desired. Maybe a rowboat with a romantic couple going in between. It was a beautiful scene, but that doesn't necessarily make it a great photo. Some of you may have seen this one before. I had gone swimming right there. It's so awesome. This is also in Croatia, near, I think it's Poreč in the background. The water there is like 8 feet deep, and it's just a cliff that drops off. There's fish in there. It's kind of sort of like coral. Amazing. And the only thing that's not natural, they poured a little concrete to make the rocks a little more easy to walk on with bare feet. And they've got obviously the ladder so you can actually get yourself out of there without too much trouble. But look at the beautiful color, these aqua turquoise kind of colors. The texture, you get this kind of like tortoiseshell effect. So amazing to swim there and be there. Not such a great photo. I'm glad I have the picture to remind myself of how much fun I had swimming there. Not so happy about the sunburn. But again, not going to hang the picture on the wall. Bosque della Pace, if you haven't been, you must go, even if you're not a photographer. In fact, if you're a photographer, I highly recommend at least one day don't take any pictures. Just experience the blast off of thousands of geese taking off mostly over you. Hopefully not like directly over you, but it's amazing, both visually and auditorially, is that right? The sound is pretty incredible. But if the conditions aren't right, in this case, they kind of didn't take off quite in as much of a cohesive group as they might otherwise. They kind of went over in the other direction instead of coming straight overhead. It ended up just not being a good morning for it. I did come back the next morning, and I did get some great photos that I really love. But that morning, I thought this was amazing. Now, I'm like, why haven't I deleted this one yet? Oh yeah, because I pretty much never delete photos. This was so amazing. So I'm on a boat in Alaska. We're about to have lunch. And a whale woke up. Apparently had been sleeping, got startled by the boat. We didn't know it was there. He didn't know we were coming. You see the splash in the foreground? That was the first time he breached. Closer to the boat, when I didn't yet have my camera ready. But I got him the next time. Sort of. As he's going away from me. Not the best angle. Horrible, no, horrible. It's a really overcast sky. Not the best lighting conditions. I'm giving you an embellished view, AKA false. This is like kind of sort, maybe not the best. Maybe I could have worked a little harder and come up with something a little bit better. But this is what I started with. Do you want to see what I really started with? Whoa. Yeah, maybe that one gets thrown away. Except it tells a good story about this concept of you have this experience. Whoa, this whale jumped like 4 or 5 times. It was so cool. Except I got to crop it down to just this tiny little thing to get anything out of it. It was so noisy. What was the ISO 800? Except I think this was a while ago, so I think it was the 20D. A little bit of a noisy camera. Not great in the noise department. Problematic in a variety of ways. But it was so cool to experience it. Fortunately, later in the trip, more whales jumping all over the place. Well, again, not jumping all over the place, but breaching every now and then. So I think it's important to kind of separate out that emotion when you're reviewing your photos. That's, I think, a very, very big lesson. But then also it relates to then applying what was wrong with that picture and how can I avoid that in the future. Sometimes you're not going to have a whole lot of control. Like, what am I going to bait the water and, like, put a sign, "Dear whale, please jump here." 10 feet, yeah, exactly. But please mind the position of the rainbow in the background because that's kind of going to be in the frame. Yeah, exactly. So, sometimes you don't have so much control. Sometimes you have more control. Sometimes you don't have control, but if you can anticipate. So with the photos at Bosque del Apache, for example, recognizing why didn't that work? Because the birds went in the wrong direction. Not my fault. But tomorrow, I'm going to pay attention. Can I get to a different position where they're more likely to go? Is it just chance? Talk to other people. Hey, do they always go the same direction? Oh, wind direction. Gotcha. So there are things that you can do to kind of educate yourself. We'll talk more about those momentarily. So one of the things that I find a lot of photographers struggle with is what settings shall I use for my photos? And what I try to do when I'm answering them is to force them to think about it a little bit more. And to force them to recognize the conditions that are going to cause them to get one result versus the other. So coming back over into the metadata here, for example, well, we can just look right up here. 180th of a second. 180th of a second. Well, that's a fast shutter speed. Well, it's all relative. What's a fast airplane? Well, it depends. Is the airplane fully enclosed? How close to the ground is it flying? A lot of things are variable. And here, when we're photographing water, what I find a lot of photographers completely ignore is the speed of the water and gaining a sense over time. I'm not expecting you to look back at a creek and say, okay, that looks like a flow rate of 82 centimeters. I don't even know how you'd measure flow rate of water like that, but a boat on the surface would move at a rate of 6 knots. And therefore, looking at my trusty iPhone app, 6-knot creek speed with partial rock obscuration gives me a shutter speed of 1/8 of a second. Actually, now that I think about it, we should probably make an app like that, shouldn't we? That would be very helpful. Because I don't know what you'd throw in the water to calculate speed, but maybe we could have like a sensor in the phone or something. Let's work on that together. Here the water's moving pretty quick. 180th of a second. That's a fast shutter speed in the context of flowing water. To which, look down below, and you see that we have this sort of stuttered effect in the lower falls here. There's Multnomah Falls, by the way, in case you want to go find that bridge in Oregon. We got that kind of stuttered effect. Fast, but not super fast. Look at the water in the background. Nice and ribbony smooth, because that water's moving pretty quickly. And so 180th of a second, still not really going to slow down that water all that much. But then when we slow down a little further, half a second. Now we've got the effect I was after. So 180th of a second, I thought was going to freeze the water. And then you get this effect in the background. It's, whoa, wait a minute. And maybe you start to learn a thing or two about those speeds and how much do you need. And then here, do I need half a second? No, in a lot of cases, if it's a river or creek, half a second might be too long. It depends on that flow rate. And again, I don't expect you to calculate the flow rate and measure and bring all this sophisticated scientific equipment with infrared scanners. No, but you start to get a feel. And more often than not, when I'm walking around with photographers, we're going to photograph something. Just last week, we were photographing skateboarders and guys on their bikes, and we want to slow things down. And I see a lot of photographers, 100 ISO, and stop down the aperture all the way. Well, what shutter speed are you getting? Oh, I got a quarter of a second. Yeah, you're not going to be panning with this bike, this guy doing tricks on his bike for a full quarter of a second. You don't need much. He's spinning and doing all this fast motion. You don't need very much. If you slow that down to a 20th of a second, a 30th of a second, even at a 60th of a second, you probably get a good blur. But it's that anticipation. I don't expect you to nail your settings every time. To look at a scene and say, okay, I need f11 and 1/250th of a second at 100 ISO, and I'll get exactly what I want in every respect. That'd be really cool, and someday I hope to achieve that. But I'm happy with getting pretty close, being able to anticipate, being thoughtful about what those speeds need to be. And so here, a third of a second, half a second, but here only a quarter of a second. 1.5 seconds. So here trying to get this kind of obscured, kind of hazy sort of effect in the foreground. 1.5 seconds. And then that's 0.7 seconds, and it's only a third of a second. So from here to here, it's a pretty significant difference in terms of the overall time, but the effect is not dramatically different. And so gaining an understanding of what sort of effect am I going to get? How fast a shutter speed do I need to freeze the water? Because that varies. Under normal circumstances, when we think flowing water, 180th, that's probably going to be fast enough, right? You'd be surprised. If you haven't photographed much moving water, you'd be surprised at how blurry the shot can be sometimes. Maybe you've even had handheld shots at 180th of a second that weren't sharp because of camera movement or photographer movement. But then as you gain a sense, if you actually pay attention to what shutter speeds did you like versus not like, and you start to develop more and more of a sense. So part of it, a big part of this, really just comes down to paying attention to the metadata in your photos, which Lightroom fortunately makes very easy to find. So off to Rome we go. So this is a classic Fiat 500. Anybody? So you can go to Rome and you can pay somebody to take you for a tour in a Fiat 500 around all the classic scenes of Rome. It's pretty fun, except for the part where you're getting into the Fiat 500 and back out of the Fiat 500. And I can't tell you how many, I'm not even that tall, I'm just a hair over 6 feet tall. I can't tell you how many people on the side of the road were taking pictures of me, because my head was sticking out of the sunroof just a little bit, and my elbow is like halfway down the door, and I look like a giant, and I'm not even that big. It's just a tiny little car. And I kid you not, there were 4 of us in this car. I was the tallest one, but still. So we get this little tour and cruising around. And one of the things I like about doing local tours in various places, anywhere I go, is that they're going to know things that I don't know, because they're going to know stuff that's not in all the tour books. I'm sure you guys have some secret spots that you love photographing in New York City, for example. I have the same. And so I love going around to these places, sharing them with others, keeping the secrets to myself, whatever the case may be. But it's really cool to find somebody local. When I go somewhere, I always want to talk to a local photographer and say, hey, what are the cool spots that you recommend for photography? So they gave me some great suggestions, some areas that I hadn't seen, and more importantly, to the point of kind of knowing my subject, gaining a better sense of, in this case, the history of Rome, etc. So I took this cool little car around and found this cool little spot and took a few pictures of it and realized I needed to go back. Not that I needed too big of an excuse to go back to Rome, but in this case, the photo's just not that good. So it's a cool concept. So this is a view of the famous, of course, Basilica, St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City, but viewed from this hilltop. Technically, that's Malta, but viewed from this hilltop overlooking down this little corridor. You see these little bright flares up at the top, this lens vignetting of some sort? That's actually the top of the keyhole that I'm photographing through. because you got to look through a keyhole because the door's locked. Now, I have had 2 opportunities to see through the open door. The first time I was so caught off guard, I'm like, whoa, the door's open. Whoa, it's closed. The second time I got off a few shots and felt like a total jerk to the guy who was trying to just walk out the door, but I'm sure they're used to this because it's kind of a big tourist attraction. Well, small tourist attraction, a lot of people don't know about it. But notice the exposure in the background, pretty difficult. So I'm trying to darken things up. Whoa, okay, well this shows promise. It's better if you look over here on the other display. So this shows promise, that now I've got no information because I'm looking down this dark tunnel. It's basically a tunnel formed by the foliage here, the bushes along each side. So you're looking down this tunnel through a keyhole. I mean, just getting things aligned so that you can get an actual photo is a little bit of a challenge. But I didn't realize how much of a challenge it was until I left. And saw the pictures I had and wasn't going back there until the following year because, good excuse to go back to Rome. But I realized looking at the shadow information, looking at the histogram, whoo! When's the last time you saw a histogram like that? When's the last time that a photographer let you see their histogram if it looked like that? A little bit of clipping of the shadow details, so you know that all of this stuff out here is just black, there's no information, and I knew it would be a more interesting photo after having seen that histogram if I had more information. How do I get more information? HDR. I'm not a big fan of HDR. I'm not a big fan of HDR. What's HDR? High dynamic range imaging. It's where we capture a sequence of images. So there is an image that I would say, considering the sky conditions, is pretty well exposed for the basilica in the background. And then we capture a little bit brighter, and then we capture a little bit brighter. So we've got more information to work with. So now you get a better sense of, kind of what it's like. Because remember, your eyeballs, everybody likes, well, not everybody, some photographers like to say that your eyes are HDR. They got built-in HDR. No, your eyes are variable exposure. So your pupil, your aperture essentially, is opening and closing in real time based on bright versus dark. Sometimes it's a little slow, like you come out of a movie theater and you're blinded by the daylight. But the camera isn't able to make that adjustment on the fly in variable areas, et cetera, et cetera. Cameras are getting more sophisticated and have all sorts of cool stuff that they can do. But the point is that in order to maintain all of that detail, I've got to record more information. I've got to record a sequence of exposures that I can then use other software to put together. Now, of course, HDR has gotten to be pretty popular. I didn't necessarily need to look at my histogram to realize that, boy, I should have thought about HDR. But I can tell you that after this experience in Rome, I started to get a little more thoughtful about actually capturing HDR sequences, even if I wasn't sure that I eventually wanted an HDR photo. So then the final result with a little bit of cropping, we've got a reasonable balance. Now, personally, I'm not a huge fan of HDR, so when I put together an image that is HDR, I'm still going to try to maintain a pretty good amount of contrast. I'm just trying to preserve detail. I'm not trying to make, in most cases, this really accentuated type of image. But then taking that same concept, so I'm in Austria. This is the Abbey at Melk along the Danube River in the Wachau region of Austria. Really impressive, cool place. If you stand out here for, about hour and a half, you might actually get a 10-second sequence where you have no people in the frame. They'll still have these like advertising boards, or whatever, that are way off there in, let me zoom, because I set the other zoom setting. Off in the background, you can probably see those little white boards. I would be really happy if they weren't there. But I wouldn't have normally thought to capture this as an HDR. And I don't really want this super HDR effect, but recognizing that the shadows were really dark, and I'm trying to preserve more of that information, I'm now more thoughtful of it. Again, a situation where I can expose for the sky and no problem. This is an HDR. There was not very much shadow detail in the image that was exposed for the sky. So down below, it was really lacking a lot. Not that it's an amazing photo, but it would lack any detail at all, really, if it was just a single exposure. Likewise here, this is at sunrise in Maine, of course, and just inky black. So all the rocks in the foreground here, they've got this like slippery, very slippery black. It's like a lichen or moss or whatever the heck it is. That is, did I mention slippery? On these, and the rocks, they're very hard. And the water, it's very cold. I recommend caution. But very, very dark. They're just not reflecting that much light. And so capturing multiple exposures, blending them together, really makes the photo. This is outside of Savannah, Georgia, Wormslow. This would be impossible without HDR. Well, impossible. It would be a very different picture without HDR. Would you ever expect that this is an HDR image? Probably not. Actually, the only reason that I created it as an HDR is because of the sun angle. I was getting really, really strong reflections on the metal portions of the building. And so that helped to just tone things down to make it look a little bit more natural. A little more dramatic result, of course, with some additional effects applied. But again, where the detail, especially in the foreground rocks there, because they're so wet, they're just not reflecting much light, much meaningful information. So creating an HDR there. Same thing, just trying to get a little more of the nuanced detail in the locomotive, not trying to make anything that's too crazy. It's a little dramatic because of the wide angle lens that was used, the perspective there. But mostly, again, just trying to preserve information. This, again, a little more dramatic result. Just preserving information. Really just preserving information. Mostly this was because of the sky. In theory, this could have just been a 2-image composite to keep the information in the sky. Because it was a bit overcast, the cloud cover was pretty high, very dark in the foreground, and so with the bright sun hitting some of the white areas of the clouds in the background, really difficult to get a single exposure that would have worked well, and so just blending those together as an HDR. Same basic concept. Mostly in this case, bringing out shadow detail, trying not to get too overboard with it. Then trying to get overboard with it. A little bit. Kind of a grungy sort of look. Just this is in Bratislava, Slovakia. If you've not been, lots of really old buildings, old apartment buildings that look like they're just kind of crumbling. So it has this kind of aged feel to it. So trying to convey that. Just retaining details. So this is the Pantheon in Rome. And so trying to preserve some of the information with the strong backlighting. In order to retain a reasonable amount of that sunburst effect, I would have needed to stop down to apply an exposure compensation that was pretty significant, and I would have lost a lot of foreground detail. With night shots, very often, I will use HDR. Hopefully you don't feel that this looks too dramatically like an HDR effect. It's just about pulling out a little bit of that shadow detail so that I have a little more of the nuance, because remember, when you're there, your eyes are adjusting and you're able to pick out some more of the details that are there. The camera can't really do that in most cases, and so HDR really just for that purpose. And also on top of the dome, the cupola, a lot of the details there because they've got these bright spotlights lighting up the dome, and so that gets blown out very easily, whereas down by the bridge, for example, on the Tiber River, it's very, very dark. And so just to balance that exposure out just a little bit. And then this one too, same basic concept. This is also one of my favorite viewpoints in Rome, up above, not too far from Spanish Steps. So preserving some of the information, the brightly lit dome, but then also some of that nuanced detail. Again, I'm not trying to make it look like there was some big, huge flash in the sky that was illuminating, applying a fill flash effect. I'm just trying to help you pick out some of those subtle details so you can kind of see all these layers within the layered city. Get it? Look what I did there.
Do you still find yourself using graduated filters in a camera?
Do I still find myself using graduated filters? No. In large part because we have the ability now, software makes it pretty easy to assemble HDR images, and because the graduated filter is only graduated linearly. It's the common thing of it's a graduated scene, except there's a tree sticking up above the horizon or a building up above the horizon or what have you. And I still see it in other photos today, and it drives me nuts when I see pictures that have been captured that way, where it's like, look, I can see the gradation across the mountain. It worked really well for the sky, but not so good for the mountain. And so I don't even carry with me a graduated neutral density filter anymore because we've got the software ability. So timing matters. This is less a matter of necessarily needing software and metadata, and more so just evaluating the photos themselves. So I like to get out on edges, mostly because I like other people's reactions when they see me out there and they kind of freak out. And so I've had a lot of people send me pictures of myself kind of hanging out on ledges. There I am 1,000 feet above the Colorado River. This is Horseshoe Bend outside of Page, Arizona. And most of the time when I'm out there, I end up being the subject of a lot of photos because people, I would say better than half the people, not comfortable getting anywhere near the edge. Some people, like me, stupid enough to get right at the edge. I actually had somebody who was going to subscribe to my Gray Learning video training library, and he sent me an email saying that he saw some of these pictures of me. He was going to sign up for 3 years, but after seeing these, he decided to only opt for the 2-year plan.
Did he not think you were going to survive?
He
the
thought
third year,
he thought all it was going to take was a wind gust at a bad time, and I would not be producing any more video content. So this is where this is my favorite place to sit at Horseshoe Bend. Highly recommended if you've got the balance and the stomach for it. So again, literally 1,000 feet above the water. The boats look so tiny passing by. You've got like river rafts going through underneath. But from this position, you've got the ability. I need to get sponsorship from shoe companies for this, I think. You're able to get this pretty cool angle, but look at the horrible light, because this happened on a trip where somebody else was setting the schedule. And we had a narrow time window. And you take what you're given. And that's pretty much what I got. And I thought to myself, this could be a really cool photo. Now, admittedly, I do sort of feel that there's only one photo to be had there. I don't mean that quite literally, but mostly. But I recognized that the light was bad. So well, maybe if I turn the camera over to the side and get a little different angle, that'll make it less interesting. And it doesn't really hide the fact that the lighting was not so good. Ooh, maybe a vertical, nobody will notice. I'll just turn to the side. Now I'm going to shoot in the correct direction for the light angle. Except now the main attraction is over here behind me, so that's not working very well. I can cut out the sky with creative angling of the camera and more feet pictures. And again, trying to figure, is there a way that I can get a usable photo with difficult lighting conditions? So I had to go back, of course, as with so many great stuff. And I had to go hang my camera over the ledge. Could happen.
You're missing a shot.
We are missing a shot in between. And if I showed you the metadata for these photos, you would actually discover that this picture was taken first, and then this picture was taken second after I walked around the ledge and back to the other side. Yeah, we talked about like photoshopping myself in between, but So, well, the backpack provides ballast to keep you.
This is why I'm an event photographer.
Wait, that's why he's an event photographer. But he mentioned earlier that he was a wedding photographer also. So he would rather deal with brides at a wedding. I've chosen cliffs. I don't know. Sitting there. So familiar spot? Looks much better. Perfect? No. I still have to go back because I need nice puffy cumulus clouds scattered among the blue sky. But I'm learning each time and figuring out each time what works, what doesn't, what angles I like, what I don't like. Eventually, I'm going to be there for a long enough stretch of time that I'm going to get a perfect sky. I don't want to have to get up for sunrise or anything, but I mean, maybe just one day. Who else doesn't want to get up at sunrise? Okay, it's just me, fine. Yeah, now nobody else is going to admit it. I bare my soul, and you claim you get up for sunrise.
I have lots of really nice sunsets.
Lots of good sunsets, not very many sunrises. It's practically the same thing. But how many of you have been frustrated by the fact that a sunset and a sunrise always look very different? They should not. It is the exact same thing in the opposite direction. I don't understand how they can look so different. These are the things that keep me up at night. And then I can't wake up for sunrise. So, using your knowledge. Now, this is one where you could just use metadata and learn later. I actually just wasn't paying attention. Didn't think about it. I had the knowledge, and I didn't even realize that I had the knowledge. Because I had the factual knowledge, but not the artistic sensibility. And that is, what's wrong with this picture? Now, there are many things wrong. Propeller. What's wrong with the propeller? Mayday, mayday. we're going in because the photographer used 1/2000th of a second for his shutter speed. So the propeller is just frozen, not generating any power. So I took this without thinking. And it's not that I didn't know how fast the propeller turns, because I do, but what I didn't think of was that I actually wanted the propeller turning, or that it would look like it was turning. You think fast-moving subject, fast shutter speed. Frozen in time, including the propeller. No, well, how fast a shutter speed can we use? What's the fastest we can use? I actually knew this, so I could actually figure this out because I actually used to fly long time ago. This is like not that far after the high school stuff. But I got my private pilot's license. So under the planes I flew, the propeller turns at 2,400 revolutions per minute. So how, we can kind of do the math. I know it sounds a little nutty, right? But you actually can do the math and figure out how much of the arc is going to be covered with a certain amount of time. You figure it all out. But the point is that it can't be 2,000th of a second. As it turns out, it's about 125th of a second or so with most cases. Different airplanes turn the propellers at different rates. There's all sorts of variables there. But by and large, slowing things down a little bit. Now you slow it down a little bit. Well, let's take a look here. What do we got? Is that 2/50th? 7/50th of a second. I hadn't learned my lesson yet. But 7/50th. This guy obviously is turning that prop at a pretty high rate, where 7/50th isn't even freezing it. But we're still not getting that much in the way of a blur. Versus here, a little bit more. But now it looks totally blurred. If you look closely, the underside of the wings look a little blurred too. So you start to learn too about angles and what's working and what's not working. All right, we're getting there. Now we're starting to see some blur. And now he's flying away from me. Great, I learned my lesson too late. Now here we go. What's this at? 125th of a second. What did I say? How did I know that? Math. 2,400 RPM. It's a 3-bladed propeller. Carry the 1. Look at your metadata in Lightroom, and you got it. So about 125th of a second or slower. Never want to get it any faster than that because I don't want the prop to be frozen. Now I can lock in a manual exposure because the light on the subject is not changing. I know what I want. I don't care if he's in the sky or over the wheat field. Yes, it doesn't matter. The camera thinks it matters. I go up into the sky and whoa, it's very bright, we better darken it up. I go down into just the field and this is, well, it's really dark, we better brighten it up. I'm thinking about the airplane, so I figure out an exposure that works for the airplane, including that shutter speed, and now I can start thinking about, do you see that person's head at the bottom right corner? Now I can start thinking about ducking and diving into the nearest ditch as the airplane flies by. But then paying attention also. So, we've got the shutter speed thing, but how about paying attention to what our subject is doing? Because guess what crop dusters are doing when they're spraying the fields? They're doing it in an orderly fashion. Ever mow a lawn? How many of you do this like zigzag swirly pattern all over until you happen to have covered everything? No, you go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and that's what they do. So if you watch for a couple passes, now you know, are they coming closer, further away? Which way is the wind blowing? How far down does landing gear stick out? But then we can get this sequence of airplane pictures flying toward, getting those wingtip vortices. So we get the swirl of, I think he's just watering the plants here probably. Or maybe it's pesticide or herbicide. They might be watering though, we don't know. No. And then again, thinking about ducking. Notice how close to the airplane the shadow is. It's kind of, wow. And then panning with. So when he crosses over, panning with the subject. Here again, 180th of a second. 78 millimeter lens. Well, not 78 millimeter, but at a focal length, it was probably the 70 to 200, I'm guessing. 75 millimeters. And he's going away. And what was this? 73 millimeters. Oh yes, we get very close to these guys. We get very close. Usually I don't get wet. Sometimes the van smells a little bit like malathion afterwards. But no, we stay to the side and upwind. Upwind, very important. Yeah, that's not metadata, but it's good. Good to pay attention to. And again, not getting too much of a blur where the prop disappears, but paying attention. So now, when you go out and photograph crop dusters, you can even join me in the Palouse and we'll photograph crop dusters together. You're going to know 180th, 125th of a second, shutter speed, right on the money. So planning ahead and getting lucky. Luck is like 90% of my photography, personally. I mean 10%, sorry, at the back. But anticipating, thinking, learning about stuff. So this is in Florence, Italy, the Duomo. Huge. I think they can fit like 1,000 people or something inside. Maybe it's more than that. Somebody can look it up. You can Wikipedia that real fast if you want to. It's huge. This place is massive. And it's really interesting in terms of the design, the ornamentation. So this is the first time I went to Florence, never even knew what a Duomo was. And photographing and just checking things, trying to find an interesting angle, not finding much. And then rented a scooter, because whenever we're in Italy, we rent a scooter. You think being on top of a cliff 1,000 feet over the Colorado River is scary? Try riding a scooter in Rome, or Florence for that matter. But because we had this scooter, we were able to scoot around and get up toward this hilltop. Now at this point, I didn't really know a whole lot about the location. We're basically just mindlessly wandering around on scooter. I'm like, oh, there's a different vantage point of that Duomo. Huh, it's interesting. There we go. So this is just above Ponte Vecchio, basically. Now this is probably like some point and shoot little camera. This is like 10 years ago or something. But I'm starting to get this sense that like, this could be cool. Too bad we leave for Milan tomorrow. But I, formulating this idea, and too bad that you see the scaffolding over there on the right-hand side of the Duomo. So in theory, I'm like, you know what, I'm going to plan ahead and go back when there's no scaffolding and when I'm a better photographer and I know how to make starbursts and there's a really nice sky. So, because I don't even know, I don't have this, well, we don't have to find out what camera it is, but go back. So this is on the next trip. And again, exploring around, maybe I want to straighten this one out a little bit, but just snapping around, again, exploring around the Duomo itself, trying to find interesting vantage points, interesting perspectives, interesting little details within the building, but then having to return, and this time planning ahead. Now my plan was to get up to this viewpoint at around sunset, maybe a little earlier. The whole late afternoon light thing. The thing is that late afternoon light, it makes the city of Florence a little bit backlit from that vantage point, so it's actually not ideal, but I thought the color might be good, plus I had different plans in mind. Sunset, really mediocre. I might have in the past said, well, mediocre sunset, let's get out of here. But I stuck around because I've learned that most of my pictures, if they're captured just after sunset, I usually like them a lot more than the pictures during sunset or right before sunset. I knew that by looking at the time in metadata. So we hung around. It was like, if it darkens up just a little bit more, but we keep that blue, try and get as much detail in that foreground as possible. I like the hills in the background, and I really just love that Duomo. In fact, I think after putting all these pieces together from several different trips to Florence, I think I want to isolate basically just the Duomo itself. I'll leave a little room for it because it needs some space. Look on that display. Most importantly, of course, starbursts. Thank you, Mrs. Bauer. So panning, this is another one. Panning, I think, is pretty cool. Anytime I've got a moving subject, I usually, at some point, I'm going to think about panning. So 1 to 5 stars. We were playing that game earlier. How many stars is this one going to get?
1. What's the purpose?
2.
If the purpose were a bad example of panning, then what would you give? Now, I should have hastened to add, this is a genuine New York City yellow cab. And it's in Times Square. I mean, you got to add a 1/4 star for that. So what's the problem? I mean, well, what is? As if it was a single problem. But one of the key problems that you might recognize with this image when it comes to panning is, I don't know what's going on with the rear wheel of that cab. Obviously it had some hydraulics going or something. Now, you might say, well, Tim, you're not very good at following your subject. And I would say, well, that might be true. But yeah, a little bit of a twisting action or, kind of a rotational thing. But take a look at the timing. That's a 1/4 second exposure. That's kind of a long exposure. But you've seen the way taxis drive in New York City. So if that panning is across too long a time frame or too long a distance, what's the right exposure time? I don't know. Let's go back to our creek and figure out that there was a lot of variability depending on the speed of the water, et cetera, and what am I trying to accomplish. But when it comes to panning, usually if the subject we're photographing is moving at a reasonable rate, I don't need too fast or too slow a shutter speed. In fact, too slow is a problem because I'm not that steady. I mean, I am, but I intentionally kind of, I had somebody bump my elbow. For something like this, actually a little bit of too short an exposure. Why is this too short an exposure? Well, let's see what it was. 1/10 of a second, but again, probably moving pretty slow, this guy. What makes it too short? Clearly, it wasn't so short that I could keep the taxi sharp. But again, the elbow bump thing. But how about the background? Not really blurred enough. It looks more like shaky camera than it does panning blur. But then getting the timing a little bit, this took like weeks of practice. No. But then finally panning without the elbow bumpers near me so that I could get a stable shot going all the way across. And learning along the way, figuring out what are you doing wrong? What actually caused that bump? Oh, I got news for you. It wasn't actually, to be totally honest, wasn't somebody bumping my elbow. But what caused that? Probably it was me like, oh, look at taxi, I gotta get this picture really fast. And trying to move too fast, trying to work too fast. Or in the process, starting my capture too early. The way I generally describe this is track first, shoot second. Wait till you're actually tracking the subject, then press the shutter release and keep on following through till you know for sure that exposure is finished. I find a lot of photographers, I mean not me of course, anymore. A lot of photographers, myself included sometimes, you shoot before you're fully lined up with your subject, before you're really panning successfully with the subject. So sometimes I don't even shoot because I couldn't quite get him. I just was never able to stabilize my lens panning with that subject following along to get the result that I was after. So if panning is something you're interested in doing, then practice, 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 and then practice some more. So find a spot where you can get repetition. I had a great experience, boy, it's almost been 10 years now. Photograph, I'll show you a picture from it a little later, but it's not the exact same thing. But photographing a cycling race, go photograph the time trial. So I had this opportunity at the Vuelta a España, it's one of the Grand Tours in Spain. And you've got, well, by the time, it starts off with 196 riders. By the time the time trial comes around, it's been whittled down just a little bit. But you got riders every 2 to 3 minutes, depending on where we're at in the general classification. That's good opportunity. Okay, snap, snap, snap. Let me see how I did. Let me figure out what I did wrong. Is the shutter speed good? Is my exposure good? Am I panning well? Am I moving one way or the other? And so finding something, a situation where you can photograph a similar subject over and over and over again. So this just happens to be in Central Park, for example, just panning with and finding that right balance, because I want a shutter speed that is fast enough that I can pan with the frame of the bicycle successfully, but slow enough where the spokes of the wheels are blurred, and even my preference to have the foot or the legs of the cyclist blurred just a little bit. I was blurred for sure, don't worry about it. I actually personally like just a little hint of motion blur in the key subject. I know that sounds wrong, but I actually like just a little bit. I don't want them frozen in time and it looks like some weird composite. Just the tiniest little hint. I like to have the bike frame pretty solid, but just this tiny little evidence of motion in them so it looks a little bit more natural. That's just me, maybe, I don't know. You see, like your first impression is, wow, sharp bike. Then you look a little closer, and brought to you by Pinarello. The words look a little slightly fuzzy. His foot is blurred. His pedals have disappeared, the crankshaft. Just a little hint of blur in him so that we get a little more of that effect. And sometimes photographers will fire a strobe, for example, to get a sharp image plus a little ghosting from the movement. Personally, I kind of like the effect of having a little bit of that motion blur to give us a little more of a dynamic sense. So here, especially, for example, she's not exactly sharp. I wish there wasn't the other person in the background. But mostly sharp enough that we get the sense of sharp and yet still moving, but then that background getting a nice blur to it. And even with airplanes, so we talk about that shutter speed. Well, now when we're panning with the airplane, we've got to pay careful attention to our shutter speed. Here, for example, it just looks like some weird camera shake. Like, I don't understand, you were so shaky that the trees are moving, but somehow the plane was matching your frequency of motion or something because it looks sharp. It doesn't look like a panning shot, versus getting something like this where we actually, in this case, have the benefit not only of a little bit of motion in the background, but also that depth of field variation. We've got out of focus in the background helping to sort of contribute to that appearance in terms of being out of focus. And then, trying to recognize when are you missing out on certain things versus others. So when the subject is not orthogonal, when they're not traveling at a line that is perpendicular to the line of your lens, things get to be a little bit more tricky. So here, for example, the cyclist, this is Alberto Contador, who just won the Giro d'Italia and won that Vuelta a España. Not that any of you actually care, but I do. No, but he's coming kind of sort of toward me a little bit. He's not going directly on a perpendicular path. He's coming a little bit toward me. And so it's a little bit more difficult to pan and get a sharp shot because he's getting bigger as he gets closer, obviously, in terms of that relative perspective. But we still got that little bit of a panning blur. Part of the reason this is of note, that's a 180th of a second shutter speed. And yet the background is still pretty blurred. That's a pretty fast shutter speed. That's a pretty fast cyclist. All right. So reflection. So this is a little bit more straightforward. This is in Vienna. And sometimes something pops out at you and then it leads to something else. And this actually led to one of my favorite photos, all things considered. Again, bearing in mind that some of that's emotional just because the experience was cool. But this is near Stephansdom Cathedral in the center of the old part of Vienna. And it's pretty difficult to walk along Kärntnerstrasse and not see these reflections, especially at the right time of day, because it's a big old wall of mirrored windows, essentially. And so you catch, it's like, wow, that's really interesting. Let me see what I can get in the frame here. And before that, I hadn't really been paying too close of attention to reflections. Not that I never do, but it just kind of maybe, oh. And I've had this experience a lot. I'll show you a couple more examples later, where reviewing those photos triggered something else and led to a photo that I liked even better. So it was sort of a very small piece of the final puzzle. So photographing then, after I left Vienna, went to Salzburg and then up into the Alps, and this is in the tiny little town of Hallstatt, which I highly recommend if you ever find yourself in the Alps, paying attention to reflections. Trying to look for reflections. So now, look, reflections of the little pedal boats. That's kind of cool, bright red, yada yada. Still not quite doing it, but interesting. Reflections of the town into the lake, but it's still not quite working, and I don't understand why it's not working. And so I saw this guy sitting there thinking. I said, I should think about this a little more. Inspiration from your photography. The only problem is I didn't know what to think about. Then a boat came by. Then the boat got closer. And I thought to myself, not to embrace stereotypes or anything, but they don't look Austrian to me. And we're in Austria. And they don't look Austrian. I'll bet they don't live here. Wait, if they don't live here and they got a boat, I'll bet I could get a boat. So I had an idea. And I found some boots. Boat. Somewhere over there, there's boats. Then I found this a really cool experience because my German, pretty much limited to the menu at German restaurants. Not so much in the conversational department. The guy renting the boats, not a word of English. I knew my numbers. That's about it. So, this is one of those where you kind of hold out some cash and let them take, what's the right amount. He had his grandson there who was peeling off these dandelions, the skin off, whatever you call them, the stem, and dropping it in the icy cold water, and it would curl up instantly because it was so cold. I'm like, I do not want to fall in the water. So I'm going to be careful with the boat. But I got in the boat, and I paid attention to the reflections, and I was happy. All because of Vienna, where I didn't get to see the Alps in Vienna. I didn't get to see a big lake in Vienna. But just kind of cluing myself in to photographic opportunities, possibilities, things that I might not have thought about. I might not have paid as much attention to the water, to the reflections, had I not been looking at those reflections in Vienna just a couple days before. I would have been looking straight up at the Alps that just rise up out of this lake like you swear it's just perfectly vertical. And then this is actually kind of a total switch that has nothing to do with metadata. So I'm fascinated by cultures, differences in cultures, which is why part of the reason that I love traveling so much. I'm also fascinated, it's not as weird as it sounds, but fascinated by cemeteries and kind of death rituals and all that. To me, it's just very fascinating. So when I find myself in a foreign country at a cemetery, I'm always very interested in kind of just seeing what it's like, but being very mindful. I try to be super, super, super respectful and extremely cautious and quiet and slow and not stepping on anything and trying to be very respectful. But this is in Tokyo, actually. And one of the things I found really fascinating about Tokyo is that back behind a big old office building, there would be a temple or a shrine, and in some cases, a little cemetery and whatnot. And so I'm trying to convey a sense of what this is like. And throughout, I see these interesting objects. And I snap a picture, this is it. And I thought it was going to be amazing. And I got back to the hotel and it wasn't. But remember that experience, or the several experiences I told you about, where emotion gets in the way. You're reviewing your photos and you think they're going to be so amazing. But it wasn't the photo that was amazing, it was your experience that was amazing. And I started to think about why this photo was so amazing to me. And I realized it had almost everything to do with the experience and not so much about the photo. Because almost right after I snapped this photo, I was feeling like I think this is going to be a good image. And then, out in the courtyard, this elderly Japanese woman got my attention. And I thought, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. I was trying to be really good, but clearly I must have done something wrong. And she kind of waves me over. My thought is, now I'm going to get yelled at in Japanese. My Japanese is worse than my German. It's like not just menu, like basically just sushi, and not even the whole menu there. So I know this is going to be difficult. I go over there, and then she leads me up the stairs. Like, I don't even know what's going on here. Should I be afraid? And she proceeds with no language. She only said one word in English, judgment, which seemed scarier than it was. But apparently, this particular shrine, I didn't realize that there are actually kind of like multiple Buddhas. I didn't know a whole lot about Buddhism and the history and all that. But apparently, there's sort of multiple variations, at least in some of the Buddhist traditions. She proceeded with no language other than that one word to teach me how to pray at this Buddhist shrine, which is a bit of a process. You get the Buddha's attention by ringing a bell or clapping, you make an offering, you bow. It's this whole big thing. And it was such an amazing experience to me, not just because I love culture and learning about different cultures and different cultural experiences and all of this, but this notion of having a dialogue, I guess you could say, well, a monologue maybe, with no language. Just somehow two people from very different cultures, very different upbringings, who are now understanding each other just purely based on just sign language, but not any official version of sign language, just kind of demonstrating, showing, and learning. It was amazing. Wonderful experience. Gives me chills every time I think about it. But the photo wasn't doing it justice. So then I actually went through this whole process of trying to think about, okay, what can I do to this image that will change it to try to convey to the best of my ability what that experience was like. And I tried to think about sort of keywords almost, timelessness, and old meaning coming from an older time, tradition, history, all these sorts of things. And it's a little bit more obvious when you start thinking of it in those terms. I said, well, let's make a black and white interpretation of this. I took that a step further and decided to make a sepia tone effect. And I decided it needed to be a little bit more moody, so I was going to add some contrast and add a vignette effect. And so I did all those things. And it ended up being a photo that I felt did convey sort of the mystery, you might say, of that experience and kind of that emotion that was behind it much more than the unedited photo, I think, really did. And so I took a photo that was a big disappointment. I thought it was going to be so great. I got back to the hotel, downloaded my images, eager to check out this photo, and I didn't like it. But then thinking more about that experience and trying to let the story lead the photo rather than the photo lead the story. I'm not trying to tell a story. I took a picture. Now I'm trying to translate it into the story that actually existed at that time. And I ended up with a result that I'm pretty happy with. So totally changing gears now. Clouds. I'm very, very picky about clouds, but slowly I'm learning not to be quite so picky. After looking at photos and having different experiences and paying attention in Lightroom to those experiences. And so set out, this is over at Brooklyn Bridge Park. Probably most of you are familiar with the shot you can get a little bit further over and up the street where you're looking through the other tower of the bridge here, looking through to the Empire State Building. So you've got the tower of the bridge with the Empire State Building right down underneath. This is Manhattan Bridge, of course. I'm sure you're all aware. Also, Manhattan Bridge, super wide angle, starbursts, mostly just kind of playing around and having fun. Clear sky, you get that kind of cobalt effect, kind of interesting. But the shot of the night was really about the Brooklyn Bridge. This was probably, well, we could tell by the cranes on the building, probably 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, something like that. Long exposure, I'm learning, paying attention. Remember how cool the water looked back with the stream, the creek, that was moving kind of fast, and we had some reflections and longer exposure, and that gets imprinted like, oh, let me try and get a long exposure. The upshot is by stopping down to get a longer exposure so that the surface of the water will be smoothed out and all those reflections just become like an aura on the water almost, I'm also getting the starbursts that everybody's a big fan of. And then, when you wander around a familiar place kind of over and over, you start to notice things that you might have otherwise missed. And a lot of times you learn something that you already knew. Like here, this is around about the 4th of July. As you can tell from the red, white, and blue. On the Empire State Building, of course, as you all recognized immediately, through the fog. And in my mind, I was thinking, I think this was last year or the year before, I don't remember exactly, but, I learned about this website where you can find out what color the Empire State Building is going to be tonight. You really impress your friends with this, it's awesome. Just Google, what color is ESB? And there's actually a couple sites. There's one that comes up that's not the official website because the official website shows you one day at a time. This not official website, at least I think, anyway, don't take my word for it, but there's another website that lists out the upcoming week or so. It's not always accurate because sometimes somebody at the last minute's like, you know what, I want it to be red tonight. Not just anybody, but. So you can anticipate. Well, so I knew that 4th of July, which obviously 4th of July with this much clouds in the sky, probably not so good for everybody who's hanging out on the Hudson River. Well, East River this time, which is not a river. True story. But I'm taking this picture that I thought was going to be so cool, and then you can't even see the subject. Thank you, low clouds. But I'm thinking, it's kind of cool though, because the city looks really interesting. This obviously is just a tight shot, but the city, as you all can imagine or have seen many times, you get that low clouds and fog, the buildings disappear up into it, it's kind of mysterious, but you also get this glow down underneath, which can be pretty cool. So I'm gonna pay attention. I'm not gonna complain so much next time I go over to Brooklyn Bridge Park and it's a little bit cloudy. You can see little hints of color in the clouds there in the sky. I'm like, it's kind of cool, has potential. Looking the other direction, back underneath the Manhattan Bridge. This was Memorial Day, or that weekend at any event. Kind of interesting. I wonder if we can take this a step further and find the nice balance in between where we've got enough cloud that it's going to reflect back a lot of the color from the sky. And this angle's interesting. Over here it works a lot better because we got this different mix of colors for those lights. So you can see a lot of like blues and purples and reds and whatnot, a little bit of yellow. And so you actually have the clouds that are hanging nice and low, reflecting back that color. So in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, look, it's a clear sky tonight. Maybe I'll head out to Brooklyn Bridge Park and try and get a photo of the bridge with a nice cobalt sky. But then paying attention to other photos and saying, actually that sky looks pretty cool. The lights of the city lighting up the clouds can work really, really nicely. So this is funny. I was playing around with a new lens and trying to decide if I was going to take some workshop participants on the Staten Island ferry, so they could go check out Staten Island. But also, because I had never really done it as a photographer, the Staten Island ferry that was, and I wasn't sure. I'm like, boy, I've been on the ferry, but I didn't use the camera, and I don't know how. I mean, you got a view of the Statue of Liberty, but how close a view do you have really? I don't know. So I decided to go check it out. I had a lens with me that I was testing out, and I got this shot. I'm like, well, not so bad. If you can get this from the Staten Island ferry, then maybe it's worth, taking a group of photographers on the Staten Island ferry instead of paying for the Liberty ferry to go to the island and photograph her from like right up close. Like maybe this will work good enough. Remember that thing about metadata? Let's go have a look. 600 millimeters. 600 millimeter lens to get that shot. Wow. Maybe not. Great view, great experience, bring along lens. So I decided that wasn't so good. And plus, I had tested this out. I didn't really have a lot of flexibility schedule-wise. Guess why this picture is black and white? I'll give you a hint. Look at that lovely drab sky. Oh, the way the total flat gray sky really makes the patina just shine. Or we'll go black and white. And it's interesting because I used to think black and white is for when like texture is really important. When the luminance values, contrast, when the color is distracting. I know that sounds maybe a little bit weird, but when it's just really all about the texture in the photo. Then I started learning that actually black and white can save you when the sky condition wasn't all that good and you want to forget about the fact that you had this really drab sky. Instead, it's just a bright sky that is allowing the statue to stand out against that very evenly toned sky in the background. It's amazing how you can trick yourself. But then I started learning that lesson a little bit more. So, you guys all photograph these? If you haven't, you're going to now. These guys are so cool. I'm telling you, you can spend hours photographing these guys. So cool. I can't remember the name of the artist. I should remember. If anybody knows, holler it.
Tom Otterman.
Thank you. Tom Otterman? Did I say that right?
N-E-S. Otter, yes.
Otterness. Todd or Tom? Tom. So Tom Otterness? Did I say it right that time? There you go. Fabulous. I love these guys. There's a few of them that have actually the old subway tokens, which I am told used to be basically, it's like a heavy round version of the Metro card. That was before my time, but that's the way they, this one's eating a penny. So lots of these cool guys. So you can find these in the 14th Street station, subway station for the ACE line, AKA the 8th Avenue station for the L line, and on both platforms, the L on your way down and on the platform. And there's sort of like a long hallway there's upstairs plus down on the platform. You'll find a bunch of them all over the place. There's some repetition. It's really, really cool. But one of the things that you'll notice if you go photograph these guys, it's really difficult to get kind of a clean background. And as soon as you have something interesting, then somebody stands in your way. And it's not like you can yell at somebody in the subway station. I don't recommend it anyway. So like trying to play, in this case, trying to get the subway going by to be blurred a little bit by motion blur. And just looking for these interesting positions and juxtapositions for the subject. But then realizing along the way, like there's a lot of distraction here. And in some way that distraction is good, meaning that the detail is part of the story. Here's these cute little statues, these little figures, in this very busy place with lots going on, lots of sort of clutter in the background. So it's this difficult balance of including the clutter but also photographing the subject in a way that makes sense. And so, thank you. He's just waiting patiently for the train with his money bag. So trying to find, so here waiting for a train to pass, waiting for a moment where somebody else isn't sitting on the bench, et cetera, et cetera. So here's the fare token. So I don't know what she's looking at, but cute little couple.
Oh, that's the one behind the fence.
This one's repeated a few places, but yeah, in one case it is behind a fence. This guy on an I-beam with the big old bull. I don't know what he's going to go fix, but I didn't want to go down that stairway, just in case. But you can kind of see that there's a lot of sort of distraction going on. There's some detail, it's a little distracting, but I also found that the color was a little bit distracting. So in some cases, this guy holding on for dear life, I was going to help him, but I had to take a picture first. But here, taking that saturation way down, not all the way down, not making a black and white, but taking that saturation way down so we get this sort of like bronzy sort of feel to the image, but also helping to cut back a lot of the distracting color, a lot of the other elements in the background. But then in some cases, completely removing that color altogether so that we get rid of all of the distractions. So it's kind of just a statue, a figure, but we've got some of that information going off into the background. So we get a sense of like, whoa, wait, where is that? I want to go photograph that too. Where is it? Obviously, it's in a busy place. If you're local, you kind of recognize the exit sign with the indication of the subway lines. If you're really good, maybe even without it being in focus, you can tell which subway line it's talking about. But because it's now black and white, a lot of that distracting stuff, the red on the exit sign and whatever color the subway indicator, maybe it was probably the blue line, so, the ACE in blue, et cetera. A lot of that distraction, including the distraction, frankly, of the color, the copper of, bronze. The bronze of the figures themselves in some ways kind of distracts, in large part because, as you'll probably recall, some more than others, this one shows a little bit more. The places where people touch it kind of polishes it a little bit. So you see like his hat is polished a little more, the coins a little more, whereas other areas, some coins are brighter than others. Part of that's light and shadow, obviously, but you can kind of see, especially when you see him in person, it's a little bit easier to see. But you can see exactly where people tend to touch them. Like if you, was it Harvard Square in Boston? There's a statue with the foot, and the foot is perfectly polished. It looks almost like gold. And the rest of it looks like old bronze that's been weathered because everybody goes and touches the shoe for good luck. But again, using that black and white to sort of remove out some of the distractions, and partly just saying, okay, how can I salvage this image and make it semi-presentable, but then actually using it sort of to, more importantly, to good effect But then along the way, so this, this whole process of trying to be thoughtful, it's not really a process, I guess, it's a lifestyle of trying to make a point of paying attention. And this really, for me, started literally with that image from high school. I was like, how did I get the starburst effect? And where did those clouds come from? And learning to pay a little bit closer attention as I'm reviewing my photos, learning to understand the equipment better. Now for me, obviously, I've got the extra added advantage since I teach photography so much. It's really helpful for me to know how a camera works. But it's not just for teaching others, obviously I'm using it in my own photography as well. But then trying to think, one of my big frustrations as a photographer is going somewhere that everybody else has already photographed and wanting to come up with something unique. Now sometimes something unique happens for me because I get a really cool sky condition or what have you. Other times I have to work at it a little bit. And some of that is a matter, I feel, of basically taking various different pieces and putting them all together. It's like the way I often think about Photoshop is one of the best ways to use Photoshop is to figure out a tool that's got something interesting and use it in an unconventional way. Now for some of you this might seem to be actually unconventional, for others not so much. But taking this concept of blur, so I like having sort of dramatic effects in my photos. I like long exposures, I like blur effects, I like just having something more interesting than a simple photographic image, for me personally. So, I'm drawn to subjects that lend themselves to some degree of interpretation. So this is up at Croton, and you've got this stepped waterfall, essentially, this causeway, and it's kind of a no-brainer, right? How many photographers would have thought, maybe I'll try a long exposure here? Pretty much all photographers, I think, would have thought of that at some point. Reflections, obviously, that comes up. You start to realize not necessarily what works for making a great photographic image, but what resonates with you as a photographer. And for me personally, I think it's most important that your photographs resonate with you. If they resonate with somebody else, that's wonderful. But first and foremost, you should be pleasing yourself as a photographer. Because number one, if you're pursuing images that are of a subject or a nature or quality that you like, you're going to do a better job of it. Because you're going to pursue it more and more carefully. But then also, why are you a photographer? Now, in fairness, many people are photographers to try to make a living, and that's certainly a wonderful pursuit. But to me, my primary purpose in life is to have some really cool memories. To be able to look back and say, man, I have done some cool things, and I didn't fall off that ledge at Horseshoe Bend. Or maybe I did, and that's what never mind. But point being is that first and foremost, I want to enjoy my photography. And so I'm trying to find ways that I will get satisfaction from my own photographic images. And so again, trying to piece things together. So for example, we all know all about creating blur effects. But what I find interesting is that so often, if I see a motion blur effect, very, very often, it's a night shot. Let me guess, with moving cars. And that's all well and good. I got one of those too. I got a bunch of those. But then saying, what if we've seen motion blurs at the water, at the coast. But a lot of times, it's with an overcast sky. It's sort of like making lemonade out of lemons. Well, I've got this drab sky. I've already got a low light situation. If I stop down, I'm going to get a pretty long exposure, all things considered anyway, so I'm already halfway there. Versus getting yourself a 10-stop neutral density filter and being able to create these blur effects during the daytime. What was the exposure here? 1.5 seconds. 1.5 seconds at only f9.5. I could have stopped down further, but I didn't because I didn't want the exposure to be too long. It started to get kind of too weird and cloudy looking. With a 10-stop neutral density filter, worked wonderfully well. Okay, so that's a little more pedestrian and normal. But still, there's a longer exposure, 10-second exposure in broad daylight. Again, thanks to that 10-stop neutral density filter. And so you start to get this effect that normally we see under overcast skies. Same sort of concept. Okay, yeah, I did say I had one of the cars on the freeway. We already saw a couple examples of this. Relatively long exposure to get that water smoothed out just a little bit of the East River that's not a river. Whoa. So this is in Venice, Italy, as you probably could tell. Photographing reflections. So I'm putting a bunch of pieces together, reflections, water, and now long exposure. This is just a 1-second exposure. But you got the ripples on the canal. Bright sunlight hitting this brightly colored building of yellow and green with some white. I'm getting this long exposure, so you get this like painterly effect. That at first you're like, what in the world is that, and why is it upside down? But then you start to put the pieces together, and you can have all sorts of fun with it. Also in Venice, I could have used a different sky, but then a longer exposure to get those gondolas moving with the rest of the scene pretty stable. So I was in Seattle. You might have recognized it from the mountain in the background. Let me take a slight detour here. Actually, you should look on that display because it looks way better. Slight detour here. One of my big, huge pet peeves. I don't have an example of the photo taken the wrong way because I wouldn't dare. Go look at postcards next time you're in Seattle. You will find this scene over and over and over again, and that Space Needle will have buildings behind it. It will not be in that open gap between the buildings. One of my biggest pet peeves. Like if you're going to take a picture of somebody in front of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, are you going to have the Eiffel Tower growing out of their head? In fairness, it depends on how much you like that person. But you understand where I'm going with that. I see so many pictures where the Space Needle is set against a building. Now, granted, you can't get it totally unobstructed without any buildings in the background because there's no space for it. But I want to have as much of an opening there. I'm going to put it in as much of an open space as I can. Just a little bonus tip. Pay attention to those intersections and overlaps. But anyhow, maybe some of you have seen the photo that will follow. This is a video clip. Seattle, Space Needle, interesting subject, interesting scene, motion blurs. I'm starting to put these pieces together. And this concept, I had a different idea in mind originally, but then put this all together. So I look up at the Space Needle. I took this photo. This happens to be a video clip, but I took a photo of the same thing. And let's have a look. This is real-time video, by the way. Notice the elevator, which just disappeared from view, moving very, very slowly, but moving at what is the normal rate for the elevator that goes up to the observation deck and restaurant at the Space Needle. That was real time. That's not sped up. That's nothing weird. That's just a video looking straight up. Pretty good winds, pretty decent clouds. So let me try once again with that neutral density filter so that I can get, what was the timing on this? 15-second exposure. A 15-second exposure, broad daylight, looking up at the Space Needle with similar clouds panning across the sky. And now I'm able to get an effect that most people immediately assume in this day and age that must be a composite. How did you blur the background without blurring the Space Needle? With a 15-second exposure. No, really. How many pictures did you layer together? None. Well, I mean one, but not layered. It's literal, that's right out of the camera. Nobody ever believes me until I inform them that there is such a thing as a 10-stop neutral density filter. That, what was the aperture here? Probably stop down all the way. Yeah, stop down to f/22, 24mm lens, 15-second exposure. And the clouds need to be moving at an appreciable rate. You saw the way the clouds are moving. It's nothing too crazy, but it's movement, visible movement. And we're able to get this, what I think is a really cool effect and an unusual effect. And I actually kind of I know a lot of photographers get offended when people say, oh, well, did you Photoshop it? Did you open that image in Photoshop? Oh, yeah. I mean, less than I used to need to, because I'm starting to learn about exposure and all. But yeah, I'm not ashamed at all to admit that I work on my photos. But then what I tell photographers, to me it's kind of a good ultimate goal, the photos that I love the most, the photos that I'm really proud of, they don't need Photoshop. I might need to touch up a little. Maybe I want to kick up the saturation a little bit, increase the clarity a little bit, open up some shadow detail or whatever. But the pictures I'm really happy with, my favorite pictures, usually need virtually nothing. They definitely don't need Photoshop, unless there was like some branch sticking into the frame that I got to do some tricky work to get rid of. But in terms of the basic photo, the exposure and the color, they're usually very, very close to spot on right out of the camera. It's the images that I messed up on that need a bit of Photoshop work. And so it's surprising, but I don't mind people knowing that I'm using computer software, because half the time that's a key ingredient, like with HDR photography. And so I don't worry much about that. And actually, I'm kind of flattered by it. When they think that I needed Photoshop to accomplish this, that's kind of cool, actually. So I kind of turn it around on its head. It's sort of like I'm proud that I'm a college dropout and that I don't have a real job and all sort of stuff. To me, it's a little odd. But to me, it's almost a compliment. Like, whoa, how'd you do that in Photoshop? That is so good that you don't even think it could be done in the camera. That's the way I'm choosing to interpret that. But again, the underlying point with all of this is about paying attention to your settings. When you're reviewing your photos, when you're going through and analyzing, figuring out what went wrong, what went right, what was working, what sorts of exposure settings are working best for different subjects, what's going wrong with my exposure settings, with the overall camera settings for the image. Obviously with raw capture, that's much less of an issue than it is if you're shooting in JPEG, for example. But following through and then thinking about your adjustments and putting it all together. My exposure was way off. That exposure is also way off. I guess I have to blend exposures and make an HDR. I like that effect, just not with that subject. Maybe I can find a subject where it will work really, really well and I'll be happy with it. But paying attention to your images during that review process, paying attention to the metadata so that you can start to put together these pieces and figure out your own solution. So here we've got a few different pieces all put together because I was paying attention, and that's been a little bit of a recurring theme here, that it's not just one thing. It's not just, oh, I should have clouds in the sky. It's putting together several different pieces and continuing to kind of have this toolkit of creative ideas, of execution ideas, meaning things that you can actually do to change the effect in camera, and paying attention to what's possible both with your camera, with yourself, with your equipment, with your subjects, and then trying to put all of that together in an interesting way, in a way that's going to enable you to create photos that are going to be different, a different interpretation of a given subject compared to everyone else. So, I hope you find that all helpful and interesting. And thank you very much for joining me today.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.